Hi everyone, welcome to 10-Minute Neuroscience. In this installment, I'll be covering the divisions of the nervous system. I'll discuss the central and peripheral divisions, as well as the subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system, the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. And I'll cover the subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system, focusing mostly on the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, although I'll also briefly cover the enteric nervous system. I'll first talk more generally about these systems and what their functions are, and then in the latter part of the video, I'll cover some of the finer details like the anatomical and physiological differences among the different divisions of the autonomic nervous system. The central nervous system consists of your brain and spinal cord. Now, if we want to do something like make a movement, let's say I want to walk across the floor, the signals to initiate the movement will begin in my brain, and they'll get sent along pathways that travel down from the brain to the spinal cord, and then down the spinal cord until they reach neurons that stretch out to muscles that need to contract to make the movement that I want to make. But then the signal has to leave the spinal cord to travel out to those muscles, and this is where the peripheral nervous system comes into play. The peripheral nervous system consists of all of the nerves that connect the spinal cord to the rest of the body, as well as the brainstem to the rest of the body in the case of the cranial nerves. So the peripheral nervous system includes nerves that travel from the spinal cord to the body to do things like cause movements to occur, but it also consists of nerves that travel from the periphery of the body to the spinal cord, carrying information like sensory signals. For example, if I reach out to touch something, that sensation will be detected by receptors in my skin, which will be activated and send the information along sensory nerves in the peripheral nervous system to the spinal cord, where the signal will be carried up to the brain to be processed. And there are also components of the peripheral nervous system that extend from the central nervous system to the body to regulate the function of various other muscles, glands, and organs in the body. And much of this regulation goes on without the need for us to be consciously aware of it. We'll come back to that soon. So the central nervous system is made up of the brain and spinal cord, but the peripheral nervous system consists of everything else and is necessary to allow the brain to control the rest of the body as well as receive information from it. The peripheral nervous system can be further subdivided into the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. One of the things the somatic nervous system is responsible for is voluntary movement, like me walking across the floor. The somatic nervous system also carries sensory signals that are detected by the body to the spinal cord, again, or the brainstem, so they can be sent up to the brain to be processed. Thus, the somatic nervous system generally involves things that we are conscious of, like voluntary movements and sensations we experience. But the autonomic nervous system gets its name because it's involved with functions that operate autonomously or without needing our conscious control. An easy way to remember its overall function is to think of the autonomic nervous system as the automatic nervous system. We'll talk more about autonomic nervous system functions in a couple of minutes, but they include the regulation of heart rate, blood pressure, breathing or respiration, and digestion, among many other things. And although we'll be focusing mainly on these autonomic functions that involve influencing the activity of target organs, the autonomic nervous system also gets sensory information from internal organs to keep track of things like body temperature, blood chemistry, etc., stuff that's important for it to know when controlling autonomic functions. The autonomic nervous system consists of three main divisions: the parasympathetic, sympathetic, and enteric systems. We'll focus first on the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, since these are the divisions you're most likely to learn about in an intro neuroscience course. The sympathetic nervous system is involved with preparing the body for increased activity. It's responsible for what is sometimes called the fight or flight response, which is a general response our bodies exhibit when we're in an alarming or threatening situation. The fight or flight response is an adaptive reaction to a threat that prepares our bodies to act. It causes an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, and overall cardiac output. It increases blood flow to skeletal muscles, increases the rate of breathing and oxygen intake, and so on. And these responses are considered to be part of an adaptive mechanism that helps our bodies to prepare for dealing with threats by getting the body ready for action. So pumping more blood to our skeletal muscles, for example, gets them ready to move. At the same time, during this fight or flight response, things like digestion are inhibited because they're not functions that would be worth expending energy on in a truly threatening situation. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, is responsible for functions that are in many ways the opposite of those mediated by the sympathetic nervous system. It's sometimes said to be involved with rest and digest functions rather than fight or flight functions. So it does things like decrease our heart rate and blood pressure, reduce our cardiac output, lower our rate of respiration, and increase things like digestion. It's a system that is primarily activated when you're more relaxed and your body has time to focus on things like extracting nutrients from food, restoring depleted resources, and so on. The way these two systems are sometimes taught makes it sound like either one or the other is activated, depending on if we're in a situation that requires increased activity or one that's more relaxing. But the truth is that these systems are both always active to some degree because they're both involved in many important functions throughout the body. But in extreme situations, we see a predominance of activity in one system or the other. The third and lesser known division of the autonomic nervous system is the enteric nervous system. The enteric system is involved with the regulation of the gastrointestinal tract. It consists of networks of neurons found in the walls of the GI tract and other digestive organs, and even though it's not as well known as the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, it's thought to contain somewhere between 400 to 600 million neurons, which would make it the largest and most complex division of the peripheral nervous system. Its actions are influenced by the activity of the other divisions of the autonomic nervous system, and it receives input from the central nervous system as well, but it also has been shown to be able to act more or less independently. It contains sensory neurons that can get information about the chemical environment in the gut, as well as neurons that control the movement of muscles in the GI tract, the secretion of digestive enzymes, stomach acid, and so on. Okay, so now we'll take a bit of a deeper dive into the anatomy and physiology of these nervous system divisions, focusing primarily on the autonomic nervous system. As I mentioned, the central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord, and we're not going to go into the anatomy and physiology of those structures because that's far too broad of a topic to try to cover in this video. In terms of the peripheral nervous system, though, the somatic division involves motor neurons, or neurons involved in movement, that have cell bodies in the spinal cord or brainstem and axons that travel out to muscles that need to be contracted to cause movement. It also has sensory neurons that have their cell bodies in clusters called dorsal root ganglia, which sit just outside the spinal cord. This is a cross-section of the spinal cord here. Ganglia is the plural of ganglion, which is a term that's used to refer to a group of neurons in the peripheral nervous system. In the central nervous system, we usually call this a nucleus. So both the sensory and motor pathways of the somatic nervous system are made up of single neurons that connect neurons in the spinal cord or brainstem to muscle in the case of motor neurons, or sensory receptors in the case of sensory neurons. The motor fibers leave the ventral or frontal portion of the spinal cord, and because of that, they form what are called ventral roots. And the sensory fibers enter the dorsal or back portion of the spinal cord, so they form what are called dorsal roots. Both the ventral and dorsal roots come together, though, and create spinal nerves, and these spinal nerves act as the pathway that allows for communication with the periphery of the body. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they're associated with the different parts of the spinal cord: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. Each spinal nerve supplies and receives information from a particular part of the body. Although the sensory information of the autonomic nervous system is carried along single neuron pathways, like those of the somatic nervous system, the anatomy of the efferent or outgoing pathways that influence the activity of effector organs is a bit different, because the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems use a two-neuron chain to influence the activity of effector organs. In both systems, there are neurons that extend from the brainstem or spinal cord and communicate with a second neuron. The second neurons in these chains have their cell bodies in ganglia. Again, just a term we use to describe a cluster of neurons. We call the neurons that extend from the spinal cord or brainstem out to the ganglia the preganglionic neurons, and those are colored red in these images here. While the neurons they communicate with, whose cell bodies are in the ganglia, are called the postganglionic neurons, and they're colored blue in these images. While the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems share this anatomical arrangement, there are some differences in both their anatomy and physiology. One difference is in the neurotransmitters they primarily rely on to send messages. The preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems both primarily use acetylcholine as their main neurotransmitter to communicate with postganglionic neurons. And the postganglionic parasympathetic neurons use acetylcholine as well. But the postganglionic sympathetic neurons mainly use norepinephrine to communicate with effector organs. There are also a few anatomical differences between these different systems. The preganglionic neurons for each system, for example, extend from different parts of the central nervous system. The preganglionic parasympathetic neurons extend from the brainstem and sacral spinal cord, while the preganglionic sympathetic neurons extend from the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord. Also, the parasympathetic ganglia are located close to the organs the nerves are supplying, whereas the sympathetic ganglia are located close to the spinal cord. Most of these sympathetic ganglia are connected and form what are called the sympathetic chain, while others are not connected and they're called prevertebral ganglia. The enteric nervous system has a very different structure, as it consists mainly of networks of neurons called plexuses, which are found in the walls of the gastrointestinal tract. There are two major plexuses, the myenteric or Auerbach's plexus and the submucosal or Meissner's plexus. These plexuses contain sensory and motor neurons as well as connecting neurons called interneurons. And one of the major functions of the myenteric plexus is the control of gastrointestinal motility. It coordinates muscle contractions to move food along the GI tract. The submucosal plexus is involved with various functions, including the secretion of substances like enzymes, hormones, etc., intestinal absorption and regulation of blood flow, among other things. So that's a brief introduction to the divisions of the nervous system. Thanks for watching.